Hello everyone, this is Poohead189, and today I'm going to give you the basic details of Apothecary Diaries and its setting, just in case you want to start the series or you simply wish to refresh yourself on what you might have known or what you might have missed. Now, firstly, the Apothecary Diaries is set in a fictional world, so this is certainly not Earth. However, it would be much like how Game of Thrones is not set on Earth, yet it is very heavily based on Western European culture, or at least Westeros is, and in Apothecary Diaries, the story is predominantly set in the nation of Li, which is almost exactly like medieval China. Now, people often argue what specific dynasty and dynastic period it is based off of. However, the author themselves claimed it was not based on a particular one. It seems, however, with the technology and cultural depictions, it's most heavily associated with the Ming Dynasty, which lasted from 1368 to 1644. This was the dynasty that overthrew a century of Mongol occupation during the Yuan dynasty of Mongol emperors, and sort of brought the empire back into Han Chinese control. And this was also the time when crude firearms were around, but the majority of warfare was still swords, bows, and traditional siege engines. This was also a time of colonial expansion and maritime trade and exploration, and all of these themes can be viewed to some degree in the series of Apothecary Diaries. However, again, the series depicts various aspects of different periods of Chinese history, such as various modes of dress being closer to the dress of the Song dynasty, and others from the Tang dynasty, so don't think it is purely based upon the Ming. We also get a description of the ships used in the docks of Li, which seems very much like carracks, a ship used predominantly in the 16th century. Now, I'm very familiar with carracks because they're the ships that are in some of my fictional writing. But let's look at the text of the light novels and see just the description to show that's like a carrack. Let's see. Okay, it says in Volume 9, Chapter 11, 3 large sailing ships waited for them, the biggest Mau Mau had ever seen, Mau Mau being the main character. She was told they were going by sea, and the ships looked the part. Each had 4 or 5 masts, and she saw cannons as well. The ship's construction suggested they had been heavily influenced by Western technology, but gaudy red, green, and gold coloring marked them as Leonese vessels. Mau Mau didn't know how large the ships were inside, but they looked like they could easily hold several hundred people each, maybe even 1,000 if everyone squeezed. And again, that's in Volume 9, Chapter 11. And that sounds very much like a carrack to me. Now, while Apothecary Diaries is not purely historical, as I said, there is a lot to be said on how it draws from various points of Chinese and even Japanese history to some degree. In full disclosure, while I am a historian, and most of you know that, Chinese history is not my field of expertise by a long shot. However, I did do my best to be thorough and accurate for this video, and in most of the videos that I've seen on this series, they are Chinese YouTubers and Chinese YouTube creators being asked about how Chinese Apothecary Diaries is. And I find that quite strange because really, just being Chinese yourself doesn't mean that you or they will know Chinese history better than most other people. It'd be like asking an American what the Wild West was like, or what it was like to be a slave. However, that little note aside, I don't mean to imply that the videos I saw were bad. They did do their due diligence. Like Accented Cinema pointed out in his video that the lanterns you see in the red light district of the anime are certainly Chinese lanterns, but they were supposedly made first in 1949 during the beginning of the People's Republic of China, and it's also rumored that they were made by 2 Japanese artists. But Apothecary Diaries, which seems to be sort of 16th century technology, has lamps that were made in the middle of the 20th century, so it is quite strange in that way as well. But again, those being made by Japanese artists, that is a rumor, but we do need to remember that China and Japan have a long period of influence over one another. In fact, the imperial system of Japan predominantly came from China in the 6th century, as did Buddhism. But that aside, let's continue with Apothecary Diaries. So, in Apothecary Diaries, we follow an apothecary named Mao Mao, who at the start of the series is a short, petite 17-year-old girl who was raised by a brilliant doctor, who is her surrogate father. Mao Mao is very intelligent, scientific, and almost like an East Asian-style Sherlock Holmes, as often her scientific and logical mind is requisitioned by ministers and officials to be used for solving mysteries and crimes, rather than her usual skills of alchemy and poultices. Now, I won't spoil the main plot points, but the story begins with Mao Mao being abducted and sold into slavery, and as it happens, she is bought by Li officials and sent to the rear palace, where the emperor's consorts, a few thousand women, and various male eunuchs reside, from cooks to cleaners to gardeners to handmaidens. And also, I will say that this is a note, slavery was technically abolished in the last emperor's reign, I believe, but evidently you can still be abducted and sold somehow. I will find out and make a video on that too. There are a myriad of ways to be sent to work there, meaning the rear palace. However, Mao Mao is there to pay off the debt she owes to the rear palace from the money it lost in her purchase, and so she has to work it off. Soon it is discovered her talents are more suitable to work as an apothecary, and after that it becomes apparent she has an incredibly sharp mind and an observant eye. Almost immediately you find out that while Mao Mao was raised by a legendary doctor, she was also raised working at the Verdigris Palace in the Red Light District, which is essentially the highest class brothel in the entirety of the Imperial City. It houses 3 legendary concubines called the Three Princesses, known for their beauty and skills at different forms of artistry. And they consider Mao Mao their 4th and littlest sister. However, going back to Mao Mao, she makes friends with various ladies there, both commoner and noble, meaning in the rear palace now, and she has to deal with the politics, and she captures the eye of Master Jinshi, a powerful eunuch and evident sexual predator who has a great sway in her inner court. Okay, the sexual predator part isn't explicit. However, in my opinion, Jinshi kind of seemed fairly creepy, despite his evident popularity in the series, but more on that later. Mao Mao also becomes a favorite of Lady Gyokyo, one of the 4 consorts, and works in her staff. And of course, the 4 consorts are the emperor's consorts, so the 4 women that the emperor has in his harem. Okay, now that we have the basic overview, let's look at the world building and the government. So the hierarchy of the government is very much like how any imperial government is formed. And if you're looking to world build your own imperial government, you'll likely want to pay attention to this framework. Now, while many graphs might showcase the power structure as a pyramid, that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the structure. That being said, we do have to admit the emperor is the head of state. And while wherever he is, he has the most political power, his base of strength is in the capital city. After that, his family and closest retainers, advisors, and ministers have their roles at court. Each are given their own importance based upon their responsibilities, as well as his favor. Whether they have noble blood or not, what matters is his favor and their position. Of course, nobles will still be given some amount of respect and station, but nobility will not guarantee them a high position at court. They are given a chance and granted audiences, but they have to prove their worth and skill. However, the further you move away from the capital, the more nobility is worth. If you are a minor noble and you leave the capital, almost everyone you come across will be of lower station, and if you are a high-ranking noble and the owner of a large plot of land, even the emperor must treat you well, for many of the resources and men he needs to govern comes from you and your land. Being a top minister at the capital gets you nowhere in a different province in the court of a noble, except for how much the noble does not wish to piss off the emperor. However, back in the imperial court, the court itself appears to be a hybrid of 2 different distinct parts of government of Chinese history. Firstly, it seems to be much like the 3 lords and 9 ministers system, which is something I initially deduced from my knowledge already. However, after further study, it also seems to be a hybrid with that and the 3 departments and 6 ministries system as well, which is the system of government that came after the 3 lords and 9 ministers. Now, it would be very difficult to explain beyond a simple acknowledgement that it is simply a way to organize who controls what in the government. And since Li seems to be a mixture of the two, we have the Li Emperor, and beneath him are the 3 most prominent leaders of the country, known as the Sangong, which includes both the Grand Commandant and the Prime Minister. And while it is difficult to ascertain if we have been shown all of the positions in the light novels, what we have so far, according to the wiki, are the Board of Rights, the Board of Justice, the Board of Revenue, the Ministry of War, and various high ministers including the Grand Marshal, Grand Protector, Director of Waters, Master of Agriculture, and the Grand General. Now on to eunuchs. Eunuchs, even higher ranking ones, tend to be discriminated against. They are seen as more trustworthy by nobles in the imperial family because they cannot be corrupted by lust or steal someone's family legacy. However, there is also a stigma of them being untrustworthy in general society, at least historically. Now, it's hard to say in Apothecary Diaries just how untrusted they are by general people, but they are given tasks other men cannot be given, like working in the rear palace with the women, as they can be trusted around women, concubines, and even the emperor's consorts to some degree, but they still seem to be looked down upon by the general populace. Speaking of which, let us speak about the Imperial harem. Now, in the country of Li, it seems to be very much like the Tang Dynasty harem, or Tang Dynasty. I keep saying Tang. It's T-A-N-G, sorry. I actually found a nice Reddit post on the subject, so I cannot take full credit for this information, but I'll link it in the description below. But it appears the Empress Dowager, being the Emperor's mother, is at the top. Then there's the Empress, then the 4 consorts. Then after them are the mid and low-ranking concubines and ladies. At the start of the series, there is no Empress, and the various consorts are trying to conceive a son so they can be favored, and then become the Empress of Li. Now, a concubine in the Imperial harem, below the consorts, tends to be treasured, but they have no real power in politics, other than using clever manipulation and maneuvering. These are the concubines of imperial ministers or important retainers, or even guardsmen at times. Now, outside of the palace, however, concubines are given social importance based on their beauty, skill, and representation. Now, a concubine, while traditionally used for warming someone's bed, does not necessarily always perform that service. The concubines of the Verdigris house are so widely known and important that even being granted an audience with them to play a board game like Go with Mei, or to watch Pyron dance, or to listen to Yoka recite poetry or play music, is considered an immense honor and the evening of a lifetime. A highly prized military officer named Li Haku was also bribed by Mao Mao with a pass of visiting the Verdigris house, and it is said one pass is worth a year's salary of his, and his salary seems to be quite a bit, as a military officer allowed in the outer court is extremely well off compared to the normal citizenry. Speaking of Li Haku, multiple people have come to me and said that he is literally me, which I kind of like because I too am often compared to dogs, and I'm also in love with Pyron, so ooh, lay it on thick, baby. Now, speaking of women, we do need to acknowledge that this is a patriarchal society. Much of the intrigue occurs in the rear palace, which both in Li and historical China was reserved for the imperial harem, women and eunuchs, like I said, and so much of the interactions between characters are either woman to woman eunuch, or men who are given explicit commands to respect and protect them. However, the 4 consorts are given their power by the emperor himself, and without his favor or his marriage, a top minister will likely outrank them, even if the minister in question has to show them some respect. Women in Li cannot be doctors, either. It is forbidden, and usually a woman's station is reduced to what their husband or father's station is. Now, some women can make a name for themselves on their own merits without being higher-ranking concubines from a prestigious house or a prestigious noble family, but it is exceedingly rare. It's definitely unfortunate, and even Mao Mao is sort of seen as a nepo baby to some degree, since her adoptive father is a highly respected physician. However, while most of the power lies with men, Women still tend to be given some small amount of respect, likely because the founding myth of the country itself has its initial founder as a woman. Now, there is no official art for the map of Lee, but there are a few fan maps that people have made using the information from the light novels, and there are also glimpses of maps from the anime that could be construed as accurate, depending on how much the author collaborated with the anime studio. And while the empire of Lee is fairly large, we also get hints and information of other nations the emperor and his ministers must negotiate with. The most prominent of these is the country of Shao. As you might have noticed from all the pictures in the video, the men and women from Lee have a variety of hair colors, usually on the darker end of the color spectrum. In Shao, however, people are known to have blonde, brown, or red hair with blue or green eyes like Europeans, yet it is said their nation lives in an arid, desert region, much like the Ottoman Empire, it seems. It appears to be a mixture between late medieval Europe and the Ottomans, and in fact, Shao literally translates to Sand Europe in Mandarin. They also worship in chapels in what appears to be a religion loosely based off of Christianity. It is also in Shao where the latest gunpowder technology has been developed, which appear to be flintlocks, and it is referred to as Feifa or FIFA in the country of Lee. Now, speaking of the military, it's difficult to quantify ranks, save for officers and captains, also the Grand Marshal and the Grand General, but the military of Lee seems to follow the Ming Dynasty patterns of armor and weaponry. They tend to wield the Shang spear, the Dao, and Jian swords, as well as bows and arrows, and also fire tubes for artillery. Now, the officers wear the Xuanja armor, consisting of sewn plates to make breastplates and pauldrons, and the lower-ranking soldiers seem to wear brigandines and mail. Now, if you don't know what a brigandine is simply like overlapping plates that are sort of sewn together. It can be on the inside or the outside. It really depends. There's various different types of brigandines, but that's essentially what it is. It's sort of like overlapping armored plates. Military officials, likely Haku, serve in the Forbidden Army, and that's what the army is called, the Forbidden Army, and take the martial service exam to become one, and as one might imagine, their ranking and prestige rise with their battlefield record. It also appears as if the Imperial Army, like I said, known as the Forbidden Army, is the main source of military might, but the noble clans do have their own retinues, so they have their own armed guards, essentially. So Lee seems to be a curious case of both centralized military power and a feudal one to some degree. Now, I am certain there is more, but that is all I'm able to find with only a small amount of time for research, and having only predominantly seen the anime. Anyway though, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you believe I deserve it, please leave a like and a comment, and if you want to support the Patreon or simply wish to follow me elsewhere, all the links are in the description below. Have a great one, guys. Thanks so much. See ya!